Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Labor Time, Work Measurement, and the Commensuration of Labor, and it's by P.S. Taylor. I don't know who P.S. Taylor is, but I liked the title of the piece, so I'm reading it. Managerial work study directed at the intensification of labor characterizes specifically capitalist production. According to the British Institute of Management standard textbook, quote, work study, end quote, consists of procedures for, quote, method study and, quote, work measurement, which, quote, can be used in any situation where human work is performed, end quote. Do such procedures provide the basis for a socialist organization of production? That is, do such procedures in effect, if not intent, provide a, quote, socialist form of commensuration of labor, end quote. Sohn-Rethel, 1, has argued that, quote, the mode of commensurating labor, by the social exchange process which characterizes capitalist production, end quote, and the mode of commensuration initiated by F.W. Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the, quote, father of scientific management, quote, are diametrical opposites to each other in every vital characteristic, end quote. Sohn-Rethel, 1978. How does Sohn-Rethel arrive at this representation of the, quote, Taylorian mode of commensurating labor, end quote? The essential feature of Taylor's scheme is for Sohn-Rethel, quote, Taylor's method of accurate and scientific study of unit times, end quote, which was declared by Taylor to be, quote, by far the most important element in scientific management, end quote. End quote. Taylor's aim in analyzing manual operations were in the first place to find out how the studied operation can be done with the least waste of time and minimal effort and fatigue, then to norm the operation as a composite of strictly repetitive standard parts to reduce these parts to the smallest particles or, quote, units of motion, assumed to be homogeneous in all manual operations, to time these units with the precision of fractions of a second. Finally, to use these, quote, time units as a foundation of the job evaluation for fixing correct wages and bonus rates, end quote. Sohn-Rethel, 1978. This representation, Sohn-Rethel, derives principally from Taylor's the, quote, art of cutting metals, end quote. But a somewhat divergent representation may be derived from Taylor's, quote, a piece rate system being a step towards partial solution of the labor problem, end quote. Taylor, 1895. What was the, quote, labor problem identified by Taylor? Briefly stated, the problem was the, quote, demoralization and, quote, unionization of at least certain American workforces consequent on managerial or employer piece rate cutting associated, quote, systematic soldiering or, quote, restriction of output on the part of workers. Taylor was concerned to reject any argument that such rate cutting and restriction of output were a necessary outcome of employer-labor relations. For Taylor, the apparently irreconcilable conflict between output maximization for wages paid on the part of employer and wage maximization per unit of output on the part of worker could be reconciled. Such reconciliation could be achieved, argued Taylor, since employers could afford to pay permanently higher wages, provided such wages secured correspondingly higher levels of output. And the, quote, differential piece rate, end quote, was introduced as the specific means whereby this reconciliation could be secured. Higher rates per unit of output were to be paid for production above a specified standard level, and lower rates per unit of output below this standard level. Such a system, Taylor argued, would have the effect of providing for the payment of permanently higher wages for those workers producing at above the standard level, differentiating the workforce in terms of capacities to labor at specific levels and in terms of associated wage levels, and driving away all but the best workers. Such a system would, Taylor argued, serve admirably to subvert any emergent solidarity in a workforce through engendering individuality, and hence provide at least a partial solution to the, quote, labor problem. 2. But Taylor also argued such a system must be securely founded on, quote, unit times, as determined by employers or management independently of actual work performance time and, quote, worker knowledge of work processes. That is, direct, quote, non-worker mediated, end quote, managerial knowledge of, quote, unit times was regarded as a necessary precondition for the imposition of performance and output standards, the determination of individual wage levels, and the general differentiation and individualization of a workforce. The process whereby such, quote, unit times were to be derived may be presented schematically through a consideration of the machine metal working example deployed in various representations of Taylor's activities. The various elements in any person/machine metal working process may be identified as the nature of the metal to be worked, the tool, the speed of the machine, and the speed of the attendant human motions, and so on. To the extent that the, quote, human variable cannot be more or less directly controlled by the, quote, objective means or conditions of work situation, then the, quote, subjective conditions for the condensation of labor, end quote, must be realized through some, quote, method of payment, which is intended to ensure that, quote, the worker really does expend more labor power, end quote. Marx. Now, for management, any calculation of that somewhat elusive notion of the, quote, quickest time for the job would present management with at least the possibility of imposing this quickest time for the job as a production standard against which any actual performance could be evaluated. To guard against such an invidious imposition, workers are likely to seek to ensure that, quote, the quickest time for the job, end quote, remains an intangible notion, decently shrouded in obscurity, at least as far as management is concerned. Hence the concern of, quote, scientific management is to impose, quote, the quickest time for the job, end quote, by posing the question of the quickest time and the conditions necessary to secure the quickest time, providing an answer under circumstances as far removed as possible from the contaminating constraints of any actual factory floor. In Taylor's experience, the crucial questions facing any machine metal worker related to the speed at which it was necessary to work to run the machine in order to secure a certain level of wages. 3. Excuse me. Papa's sick. But Taylor sought to impose a different order of priorities. Taylor sought to secure the conditions under which the essentially managerial question, valorization question, of the quickest time for the job was directly posed, answered, and imposed by management. Naturally, this essentially managerial problem was presented in Taylor's writings as a, quote, universal human problem, end quote. Thus, we are informed that the crucial questions, quote, which face every machinist each time that he does a piece of work on a metal cutting machine are, quote, in order to do the job in the quickest time, at what cutting speed shall I run my machine, end quote. End quote, what speed shall I use, end quote, end quote. Taylor, The Principles of Scientific Management, page 106. Taylor recounts, as his various interpreters continue to recount, that answers to such questions involved Taylor and Taylor's associates in an extended series of investigations ranging through a more or less detailed scrutiny of the variable elements of the person/machine metalworking situation. In principle, each of these variable elements was susceptible to scrutiny, respecification, and ultimately, at least, precise managerial control. Without such control, the speed of particular work processes would remain the prerogative of workers rather than management, or what was regarded as even worse, an uneasy coalition of workers in management, regardless of or even because of the particular method of payment in operation. More specifically, Taylor recounts that over a period of 26 years, he and his associates conducted investigations addressed to the problem of metal cutting speed and feed of the machine tool. Answer to these problems involved the identification of 12 independent variables and the determination of those independent variables' interactive effects. Such extended activity was eventually materialized in a slide rule ensuring that, quote, all these intricate problems can be solved in less than half a minute by any good mechanic, whether he understands anything about mathematics or not, end quote. The Principles of Scientific Management, page 111. Further, having determined the optimum speed for the machine component of the operation, comparable effort was expended with the object of determining the optimum speed of the attendant human motions. Here, the essential strategy was to analyze any given job in terms of strictly necessary component motions. In order to determine the optimum speed for each, quote, component motion, and thereby calculate an optimum overall time for the job. The outcome of such investigations was intended to be a detailed instruction card which not only specified how a given job must be performed, but also how fast that job could, even should, be performed. Thus, under the rule of scientific management, every machine metal worker was to be comforted throughout the daily performance of his tasks with an impelling manifestation of managerial knowledge of just how and how fast a job could and should be done. Now, although Sohn-Rethel suggests that in respect of this method of deriving, quote, unit times, quote, some of these features have undergone more or less considerable modifications since the days of Taylor, end quote, he also asserts that, quote, it is still the method of direct time and motion study, end quote. This assertion may be scrutinized through a consideration of the concepts and procedures outlined in the standard British managerial textbook entitled Work Study. Here we find that, quote, method study provides the necessary procedure for a managerial specification of how a job should be done, end quote, work measurement, the procedures for a managerial specification of how fast a job should be done. In, quote, work management, the crucial concepts are, quote, units of work, and, quote, standard performance, which may be located in the following extract. Quote, the unit for measuring work is founded on the notion that the human work content of many different types of job can be expressed quantitatively in terms of a common unit. In this unit, provision is made both for the effort called for by the job and an appropriate rest allowance, ... which is always related to the concept of a standard rate of working. In practice, this is represented by the average effectiveness at which a qualified worker will naturally work on a job when he or she knows and adheres to a specific method and is suitably motivated, end quote. Curry, 1977, page 140. The procedures specified for the determination that any observed workers are indeed, quote, working naturally and are, quote, suitably motivated are indicated in the following extract. Quote, by standard performance is meant the optimum rate of output that can be achieved by a qualified worker as an average for a working day or shift, due allowance being made for the necessary time required for rest. Parenthesis. An idea of what this means in practice can usually be obtained by observing the performance of workers whose output is paid for on a piecework basis. End parenthesis, end quote. Curry, 1977. Now, not only does such a method of observation introduce an essential circularity into the measurement procedures, by presupposing the existence of what the procedures are designed to secure, a piecework system which produces, quote, naturally working and, quote, suitably motivated workers, it also abrogates the basic protocols of Taylorism. For the whole import of Taylor's argument was to the effect that in order to establish, quote, scientific management, it was necessary to assume that workers, particularly on piece wages, were, quote, restricting their output, end quote, in order to optimize their wages in relations to given levels of output in work processes. Accordingly, any system of payment, if that system of payment was to operate as an adequate means of managerial control over, quote, the one element which is most vital both to employer and workman, the speed at which work is done, end quote, Taylor, Shop Management, page 45, must be founded on, quote, unit times established independently of the actual operation of any wage system on the shop floor. Otherwise, the whole system rests insecurely on, quote, ignorance and deceit. And control of the speed of work passes in effect to the workers or an uneasy coalition of workers and management. In Taylor's terms, any system of management founded on the procedures specified in work study would represent, quote, non-scientific management. It should be noted that this circularity is not circumvented through the specification of, quote, rating procedures or, quote, analytic/synthetic estimation procedures, which translate, quote, observed times into, quote, basic times. For example, according to the International Labor Office Introduction to Work Study, quote, rating is the assessment of the worker's rate of working relative to the observer's concept of the rate corresponding to standard pace, end quote. International Labor Office, 1969, page 258. But this concept of, quote, standard pace or, quote, standard performance still involves the notion of, quote, adequate motivation. For, quote, standard performance is the rate of output which qualified workers will naturally achieve without overexertion as an average over the working day or shift, provided they know and adhere to the specified method and provided they are motivated to apply themselves to their work, end quote. International Labor Office, 1969, page 259, emphasis added. Further, it is argued in this particular text that if time standards are to be useful for managerial purposes, time standards must be more or less acceptable to the majority of workers in any enterprise. Hence the expressed desirability of timing workers, quote, on the shop floor rather than under, quote, laboratory conditions. The essential circularity of the concepts and procedures of, quote, work measurement remains. In addition, there is the further consideration that, as various studies of, quote, restriction of output have revealed, the outcome of job timing on the shop floor is likely to be a process of mutually conditioning calculation on the part of those being timed and those undertaking the timing. Workers attempt to secure what they regard as a reasonable time and price for a particular job through appropriate performance, and the time study men make allowance for this in their calculations. This introduces a practical circularity into the measurement procedure over and above the conceptual circularity earlier identified. But is the adoption of such, quote, non-scientific managerial procedures contingent something that, quote, which can be ascertained only by analysis of the empirically given circumstances, end quote, or necessarily entailed in, quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers, end quote. Marx. In Capital, the book, the intensification of labor is considered as a particular method of producing surplus value. Marx argues that machinery provides a, quote, objective means for the intensification of labor during an increase in the speed at which machinery is run and or the number of machines which workers are required to operate. You just have to think of what's it, Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, which is a good movie if you like movies. But he's like, keeps getting sucked into the assembly line. For another funny thing with assembly lines, you could watch the landmark achievement that is Freddy Got Fingered when with Tom Green when he works in the cheese sandwich factory. Anyway, where he uses a does he fucking use a fucking like a block of a tube of sausage or something like that as a phallic object and keeps saying something like ding dong or something like that. It's not very rich social commentary, but it certainly is funny. Anyway. In addition, the method of payment represents the main, quote, subjective means where labor is intensified. Briefly, Marx argues that the piece wage form is, quote, most appropriate to the capitalist mode of production, end quote, because the piece wage form engenders an individualization of workers, which, quote, enables the capitalist to raise the normal degree of intensity of labor more easily, end quote. Given that the piece wage provides, quote, an exact measure of the intensity of labor, end quote, Marx. But under specifically capitalist conditions of production, that is, more or less constant transformation of the conditions, methods, and means of production, the piece wage as a means of labor intensification is rendered essentially problematic. This, as has been noted, was the problem to which Taylor directly addressed himself. However, to return to the metalworking example, if more or less precise managerial knowledge of the variables comprising the work situation is supposed, then is not any system of piece wages redundant? Why pay piece wages when time is a precise measure of how much of given commodities can be produced? Taylor's response to such a question was couched in terms of the need to, quote, adequately motivate workers even when management was in a position to specify precisely and thereby control particular work processes. Indeed, Taylor argued in general that scientific management required as a condition of its satisfactory implementation a, quote, psychological transformation on the part of both management and workers. The material means envisaged for securing such a transformation was principally the enhanced profitability or extra increments of surplus accruing consequent on the implementation of the procedures of scientific management. Such was the envisaged increase in surplus. The attention of both management and workers would be focused firmly on its size rather than its distribution. Taylor, The Principles of Scientific Management, pages 29 to 30. That is, the increased surplus accruing in respect of a given capital would enable the agents controlling that capital to secure the, quote, adequate motivation, end quote, of the, quote, attendant workforce, principally through the means of above-average wages. However, scientific advancement necessarily proceeded through the reorganization of specific work processes, in order to extend managerial control over such processes according to the valorization requirements of individual capitals. Such procedures were relatively costly to implement, but it was clearly envisaged that these procedures of competitive necessity would become generalized through various branches of production. However, such a generalization would tend to eradicate the advantage of any individual capital, eradicate any extra increment of surplus accruing to an individual scientifically managed capital. That is, the intensification of work in respect of given work processes and associated individual capitals would... What the hell? God damn it. Motherfucker. I lost my goddamn place because Word fucking Adobe Acrobat just fucking shut down. Anyway, I think this one was. However, scientific management necessarily proceeded through the reorganization of specific work processes. According to the valorization requirements of individual capitals, such procedures were relatively costly to implement, but it was clearly envisaged that they would, of complete competitive necessity, become generalized through various branches of production. However, such a generalization would tend to eradicate the advantage of any individual capital, eradicate any extra increment of surplus accruing to an individual scientifically managed capital. That is, the intensification of work in respect of given work processes and associated individual capitals would, when generalized throughout a given branch of production, result in, quote, intensity of labor, ceasing to operate as a measure of, quote, extensive magnitude. Marx. What signifies then is the labor time socially necessary for the production of given commodities, labor of variable time and constant intensity. If additional increments of surplus are not forthcoming, then the, quote, adequate motivation of the workforce remains essentially problematic. To the extent that the labor power requirements corresponded to scientific management, specified work processes cannot be secured. Then these specifications become more or less redundant. In certain circumstances and conditions, it may be more effective to secure managerial controls over the speed of work through other means. Indeed, it may be supposed that time and motion study functions more or less to legitimate rather than to specify in respect of at least certain work processes. That is, it may be argued that it intervenes in the, quote, effort bargaining between management and workers as a, quote, negotiable datum, rather than the, quote, objective datum envisaged by scientific management. For Taylor, this signifies, quote, non-scientific management, and the worst of all possible worlds, quote, ... divided control of the speed with which work shall be done, end quote. Taylor, Shop Management, pages 44 to 45. It may be argued then, whatever the merits of Taylorism at the level of individual capitals, Taylorism is contradictory at the level of capital in general. Indeed, Taylorism cannot secure its own necessary material conditions of existence in the sense of both generating and sustaining the extra increments of profit necessary to secure the, quote, psychological transformation, and accordingly the, quote, adequate motivation and, quote, natural working of the workforce. Hence the continuing existence, indeed prevalence of, quote, non-scientific managerial forms, and the non-establishment of, quote, unit times, according to Taylor's specifications, as a basis for capitalist forms of work organization. The, quote, unit times derived by the concepts and procedures of contemporary work study, and then an amalgam of, quote, analytic/synthetic estimation, end quote, based on identified, quote, basic human motions, and direct observation of actual work performances suitably, quote, discounted through, quote, rating procedures. However, it is important to note that to argue against Sohn-Rethel that the, quote, pure Taylorian unit times, end quote, are not in fact the, quote, unit times derived by contemporary time and motion study or work study, is not to argue that the former possess any, quote, universal human validity, which is lacking in the latter. On the contrary, the argument is intended to demonstrate that whatever their forms of derivation, quote, unit times, are determined by the requirements of a particular form of production of surplus value in given empirical circumstances. And whatever the particular amalgam of observation and analytic/synthetic estimation, the derived, quote, unit times are forms of measurement which are socially valid, therefore, quote, objective, solely in respect of capitalist relations of production, specifically valid solely in terms of the production of relative surplus value through the intensification of labor. They possess no other social validity or objectivity. In effect, Sohn-Rethel argues against such specific historical social validity of the, quote, unit times of, quote, scientific management. Through a representation of these, quote, unit times, as in some more or less unspecified sense constituting times relating to a, quote, economization of human motions, and a, quote, minimization of effort and fatigue, end quote. That is, Sohn-Rethel's argument universalizes the validity of the, quote, unit times. However, and setting aside for the moment the question of whether, quote, human effort and fatigue can be considered in any, quote, universal human, end quote, sense, it is quite clear from the writings of Taylor that even the, quote, unit times, derived according to the protocols of Taylorism, are not intended to be of this nature. For Taylor and his associates set aside the question of the effort and fatigue involved in work processes in favor of the question of how much of given commodities could be produced by certain work processes under optimum conditions. The question of the relationship between the effort involved in specific work processes was set aside precisely because investigations did not and were considered unlikely to reveal a relationship between effort and output which would contribute towards a managerial specification of production standards and an extension of managerial control over work processes. Work processes were to be, quote, method studied and were necessarily reorganized according to the requirements of exerting managerial control over these processes, not to the requirement of effort and fatigue minimization. That is, quote, method study, first in order to derive a managerial specification of how work could be done, and then, quote, work measurement, in order to derive a managerial specification of how fast the, quote, methodically organized work should be done. If the object of the exercise was a minimization or economization of work, then there would be a reversal of the order of these procedures. First, it would be necessary to examine particular work processes to determine how much work is entailed in particular operations. And on the basis of this determination of how much work is entailed in particular operations, to organize work processes accordingly. But it is quite apparent that this is not the concern of, quote, work study. Quote, effort, in the fatigue sense, is more or less irrelevant for the same reason that it was irrelevant for Taylor, because that what is of prime concern in managerial control over work processes, regardless of the work content of these processes, what is solely relevant for management is, quote, effort, in the sense of a worker's degree of, quote, application to managerially specified work tasks. Thus, when Sohn-Rethel states that, quote, Taylor's aims in analyzing manual operations were, ... to find out how the studied operation can be done with the least waste of time and minimal effort and fatigue, end quote. Sohn-Rethel, 1978. This is a substantial misrepresentation of the real nature of Taylorism. Indeed, Sohn-Rethel's various arguments do not provide the basis for a materialist critique of scientific management and work study. Sohn-Rethel's various arguments appear inherently ambiguous and contradictory, Take the example in the following core of Sohn-Rethel's arguments on, quote, time and motion study, end quote. Quote, in time and motion study, ... quantifying standards which are rooted in the sphere of dead labor relations come to be applied directly to live labor. Since labor is placed under the microscope, so to speak, and, quote, reduced to, quote, unit times, i.e. the precise assessment of time absorbed by the smallest elements of which a particular kind of work under review is composed as a strictly repetitive performance of the worker, cleared from waste. All qualitatively different kinds of live labor occurring in a given labor process are thus expressed as commensurate isolates. In order to, quote, yield the mathematically calculable maximum of output per time unit, end quote. In order to, quote, yield the mathematically calculable maximum of output per unit time, end quote. Sohn-Rethel. Now, this precisely identifies the organization of work through the measurement of labor times and the application of, quote, value standards derived from commodity exchange, end quote, which, as such, constitutes a form of, quote, measurement of human and technological functions in their combined productive application, end quote, but depends crucially on the labor time standard of labor commensuration, and as such cannot, quote, serve as the basic economic regulative or the organization of the entirety of social production, end quote, for the purposes of any socialist organization of social production. Further, when it is stated that, quote, it amounts, of course, to nothing more than a pretense to proclaim that arbitrarily fixed time rates for a job, in units or no units, as norms of independent validity, as if they were extracted miraculously from the bosom of nature, or even represented some prescience of the intellect, end quote. Such a statement is end quote, Sohn-Rethel. Such a statement is deprived of all its potential strategic force because Sohn-Rethel has failed to specify the precise nature of these, quote, unit times, and hence their very specific social validity, inextricably bound up as these, quote, unit times are with the intensification of labor under capitalist conditions of production. One important question raised by the preceding argument is whether work can in fact be measured. Now, various studies of, quote, output restriction have clearly revealed that in at least certain circumstances and conditions, workers do engage in processes of measuring work. Such processes are socially conditioned in various ways, and under conditions of wage labor are likely to entail a calculation of, quote, effort values in monetary terms. Nevertheless, what is involved is an essentially social process of work measurement by workers actually engaged in specific work processes. And it is further apparent that work is something which is experienced, calculated, measured socially in various forms according to the particular conditions of individuality and solidarity prevailing in actual cooperative work processes. That is, the particular form of social cooperation constituting certain work processes determines the work effort and fatigue entailed in such processes. It follows that the work entailed in specific work processes can be measured by the actual workers engaged in such processes. That is, work measurement is a necessary constitutive component of any cooperative productive activity and is essentially a social process carried on by people as essentially, quote, social animals. It also follows that such forms of work measurement are unacceptable for managerial purposes, indeed inaccessible to management. In differentiating managerial, quote, work measurement and workers' measurement, it is important to recognize that although any process of production can be considered, quote, from two distinct points of view, one, as labor process, and two, as valorization process, end quote, it is nevertheless implicit that the labor process is single and indivisible. The work is not done twice over, once to produce a suitable product, a use value, to transform the means of production into products, and a second time to generate value and surplus value, to valorize value. Work is contributed only in the definite, concrete, specific form, manner, mode of existence in which work is purposive activity that can convert the means of production into a specific product, end quote. Marx. As purposive activity, work cannot be measured independently of the purpose, meaning social significance it has for the worker. Such considerations are indeed irrelevant in terms of the process of valorization, but labor can be measured. Motions may be analyzed in abstract to provide a specification of, quote, human capacities for certain types of labor. Such motions may then be quantified in terms of the time required to produce particular commodities. But such a, quote, economization of time does not necessarily constitute a minimization of work. Work is what workers do, and can and do measure. Labor is what management can and does measure, under the rubric of, quote, work measurement, for the purpose of controlling labor processes, according to the requirements of valorization, through our economization of labor time. This is not to say that in certain circumstances and conditions, management may not seek familiarity with work purpose, meaning, significance, etc., in the interest of valorization, though through, for example, quote, employee counseling, quote, job enrichment schemes, and the like. Now it is apparent that Sohn-Rethel recognizes some of these considerations. For example, Sohn-Rethel states that Taylor's, quote, method of, quote, accurate and scientific study of time units, end quote, could be, quote, a method operated by the workers themselves, although it would certainly differ substantially from Taylorism, end quote. Sohn-Rethel. But such qualifications are subverted by the crucial identification of these, quote, unit times with the economization of time in the sense of a minimization of effort and fatigue. Rather than the requirement of a managerial intensification of labor dictated by the process of valorization. The, quote, unit times of Taylorism are labor times under conditions of capitalist production. As such, the, quote, unit times of Taylorism do not necessarily represent nor are intended to provide for any minimization of effort and fatigue. Indeed, because they are derived through a fragmentation of work processes and individualization of workers in such processes, they are as likely to involve a maximization as a minimization of the effort and fatigue entailed in the production of particular use values. In summary, it is argued here that Sohn-Rethel's critique of scientific management fails to penetrate even scientific management's own representations. In effect, Sohn-Rethel accepts Taylor's own formulation of, quote, the problem as, quote, economy of time, indicates how a solution to this problem was sought through time and motion study, and then argues that such an establishment of, quote, unit times has a human universality transcending capitalist production. Further, what is identified as the crucial moment of scientific management is the development of, quote, a novel mental/manual division of labor, end quote, in which knowledge and hence control of work processes pass from the possession of workers to management. Such a position enables Sohn-Rethel to identify, quote, ... the contrasting condition of socialized labor placed under socialism or placed under capitalism, end quote, as, quote, defined by the difference as to whether the workers are in possession or whether the workers are dispossessed of the socialization of their labor. Quote, socialism would be constituted through the repossession by the workers of such knowledge. End quote. Quote, ... the unification of mental and manual labor, end quote, admittedly, quote, ... a gradual and arduous process, end quote, and one which presupposes, quote, ... the overthrow of capitalism and a successful establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Sohn-Rethel. But it is arguable that the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat presupposes the displacement of managerial forms of work organization, which embody the disunity of mental and manual labor. And in this connection, Sohn-Rethel's advocacy of a, quote, critique of scientific management as a programmatical discipline, which could be carried into the details of the class struggle on the factory floor, ... as a weapon for countering every move of the management, end quote, is to be thoroughly welcomed. But, in effect, the various arguments presented by Sohn-Rethel provide certain ideological support for managerial forms of work organization and continuing dispossession of workers. The various arguments presented by Sohn-Rethel do not provide for a materialist critique of scientific management, and thereby contribute towards the establishment of conditions necessary for socialist forms of work organization, commensuration of labor in organization and production. The various arguments presented by Sohn-Rethel do not provide a socialist strategy, quote, on the factory floor. Much work, if not labor, is required in order to develop such a critique and engage effectively in such struggles. Okay, that's the end of the essay. You can stop listening now if you want to, but there's notes at the end. There's end notes, and I'm going to read the end notes. End note 1. For an introduction to Sohn-Rethel's stimulating and provocative arguments, see Reinfelter and Slater, 1978. What is presented here is not intended primarily as a criticism of Sohn-Rethel, but rather as a contribution to the development of the critique of, quote, scientific management, end quote, in general, and, quote, work study in particular, which Sohn-Rethel has so persuasively advocated. See, in particular, Sohn-Rethel, 1976. The argument as such has undergone certain modifications since discussion at the 1978 Conference of Socialist Economists, conference and subsequently, thanks to various comrades for critical comments. 2. Endnote 2. Somewhat in contrast to Mario Tronti, 1976, somewhat in contrast, Tronti in 1976 quotes the argument by Commons to the effect that the strategies of, quote, scientific management, quote, are doing exactly the things that force labor to become class conscious. While a man retains individuality, he is more or less proof against class feeling. He is self-conscious, ... But when his individuality is scientifically measured off in adequate parts, and each part is threatened with substitution by identical parts of other men, then his sense of superiority is gone. He and his fellow workmen compete with each other not as whole men but as units of output, ... but are ripe to recognize their solidarity and to agree not to compete, and this is the essential thing in class conflict, end quote. This is not to argue for a certain, quote, innate human calculative capacity. Next footnote. This is not to argue for a certain, quote, innate human calculative capacity, end quote, but rather, quote, workers playing according to the rules of the piecework game, end quote. See Hobsbawm, 1964. Endnote 4. See Watson, 1935, for an account of opposition to such instructions such as Thornycroft's earlier this century. It would seem that in at least certain circumstances, such instruction cards, quote, disappeared from the machines. No one knew where they went. They just vanished, end quote. Quote, charts indicating the feeds and speeds to be employed were fixed to every machine, end quote, but, quote, passive resistance and sabotage were rife, end quote. It would seem reasonable to suppose that the particular form in which, quote, Taylorism is imposed varies according to the, quote, empirically given circumstances, which require analysis for the purpose of undertaking any investigation of capitalist or managerial forms of work organization. In particular, the derivation of managerial knowledge of certain work processes may be essentially problematic, in which case it is not apparent that the notion of a, quote, capitalist labor process, end quote, is particularly constructive. For example, quote, the capitalist labor process is that specific form of the collective worker based on machinofacture in which capital, having a monopoly of knowledge and power over the relations between labor and the means of production, uses this power, this real domination, in order to enforce the object of valorization, end quote. Brighton Labor Process Group, 1977, page 13. Is this intended as the, quote, limiting case? And other, quote, non-capitalist labor processes, end quote, representing circumstances and conditions in which other objectives prevail? Friedman's 1977 discussion of, quote, worker resistance as a determinant of forms of work organization appears pertinent, but such, quote, worker resistance also appears as posited rather than located in terms of specific characteristics of capitalist production. Endnote 5. See Curry, 1977, chapters 12 to 22, for an elaboration of these notions, and International Labor Office, 1969, part 3. As far as the TUC official guide to work study is concerned, these procedures now provide a, quote, objective solution to the previous problem of the subjectivity of, quote, rating procedures. While work study is in progress, quote, it is the time of the work study man to, quote, rate the operator as well as to time him. Whereas timing is, in effect, measurement with a stopwatch, rating is a matter of individual assessment, even when made by a well-trained study man, end quote. TUC, 1970, page 9. But now that the, quote, subjective problem of, quote, rating, that is, assessing how hard an individual worker is, quote, actually working, has been solved, quote, objectified through the specification of rating procedures, quote, work can actually be, quote, measured by time, and time is what work study stopwatches and, quote, clocking in, end quote, mechanisms actually measure. I'm going to skip number 6. Endnote 7. See Capital Volume 1, Part 4, Chapter 15, 3. C. It may be noted that Marx's consideration of this form of production of relative surplus value is located as follows, quote, the objective of the development of the productivity of labor within the context of capitalist production is the shortening of that part of the working day in which the worker must work for himself, and the lengthening thereby of the other part of the day in which the worker is free to work for nothing but the capitalist. How far this result can also be attained without cheapening commodities will appear in the following chapters, where we examine the particular methods of producing relative surplus value, end quote. Palloy's 1976 presentation conflates these analytical levels and thereby precludes the possibility of developing the argument presented in this paragraph for the purpose of investigating specific forms of work organization under capitalist conditions of production. That is, addressing the important historical materialist question, quote, how is it that capitalist relations of production, seen as relations of formal subordination, determine the concrete forms of the capitalist organization of immediate production, end quote. And note 8. According to Taylor, quote, the low cost of production which accompanies a doubling of output will enable the companies to adopt this management, particularly those who adopt it first, to compete far better than they were able to before, end quote. And note 10. Indeed, Baldamus, 1961, argues that, quote, the true purpose of scientific objectivity in the practice of work measurement is precisely the opposite of what the purpose of scientific objectivity in the practice of work measurement claims to be in theory. Though precision and consistency in the form of technical terms and measuring appliances are indispensable and even important, precision and consistency in the form of technical terms and measuring appliances have the function not of eliminating the intrusion of effort conceptions, but on the contrary of detecting effort conceptions and making effort conceptions more amenable to consistent guesswork, ... The true purpose of time study, in other words, is to guess as consistently as possible the purely subjective element of effort standards, and subsequently to adjust rates of pay in accordance with those effort standards. Moreover, the very act of timing a job may raise the acceptable level of effort, end quote. But precisely why, quote, work measurement has this particular form and function is not a question which Baldamus entertains. Endnote 12. See Taylor, 1964, The Principles of Scientific Management, pages 53 to 57, and somewhat more recently, Ryan, 1947, quote, with respect to the problem of ... the absolute validity of the standards in providing for a, quote, fair day's work, end quote, ... we have concluded there is no way of determining what is a fair rate of performance for the worker until it is possible to measure and combine all the effects of work upon the individual. Pending the discovery of a method of achieving this difficult goal, the only way of establishing absolute standards fair to the worker seems to be to observe the level of effort which is used on average under present incentive conditions in industry. This represents the workers' estimates of a satisfactory balance between the return for their work and what the work costs them in terms of effort, fatigue, etc., end quote. It would seem that under capitalist conditions of production, quote, industrial applied technology, end quote, faces certain very real problems, specifically capitalist problems. Baldamus, 1961, considers that Ryan's statement constitutes the definitive statement that, at the present level of the development of, quote, industrial psychology at least, work is, quote, inherently unmeasurable. And note 13. Sorry, I had to get a big stretch there. See Himmelwhite and Mohun, 1978, particularly the appendix where the relationship between the commensuration of socially necessary labor time and clock times is lucidly sketched. As they point out, quote, in the abstraction of simple commodity exchange, there is no reason why the time that a tailor takes to produce that which is exchanged with the produce of 1 hour's labor of a carpenter should be 1 hour measured by the clock. As socially necessary labor times, these are equivalent, but clock time is only introduced with the wage-labor relation when the labor power is sold for specified amounts of time, end quote. The specific social forms through which clock times operate in the capitalist process of social commensuration of labor requires investigation. See Thompson, 1967. Sohn-Rethel fails to observe Rubin's 1973 scrupulous and crucial strictures that, quote, socially equal labor is not only qualitatively different from physiologically equal labor, but the quantitative determination of the socially equal labor can only be understood as the result of social equalization of labor. The qualitative as well as the quantitative characteristics of social labor cannot be grasped without analysis of the social form of the process of production in which the social equalization of labor takes place, end quote. See also Rubin, 1978, where Rubin aims to bring out more clearly, quote, the distinction between the social commensurability of labor, that is characteristic of any society, ... and the specific form in which this commensuration is achieved in capitalist society, the form of abstract labor, end quote. The effect of ignoring such a distinction is irredeemably reformist. Endnote 14, see Roy, 1952-54. For Baldamus, given his preoccupation with, quote, the problem that, quote, the formal contract between employer and employee is incomplete in a very fundamental sense, ... nothing is ever said about effort or efficiency, end quote. The significance of Roy's various efforts lies in the revelation of the, quote, high degree of certainty with which different kinds of operation were compared and summarily classified as, quote, bad or, quote, good, quote, hard or, quote, easy. This does not only imply that different people must experience the various components of effort in a similar way. It also means that they share specific expectations in respect of gross earnings, for the criteria of, quote, good and, quote, bad refer to the varying chances of earning a given amount of money. Thus, what is standardized is in fact the value of effort in terms of the employee's wage expectations, end quote. Pages 92 to 93, original emphasis. Rather than that, the workers, Roy observed, were engaged in a systematic and highly elaborated subversion of, quote, managerial prerogatives, founded on precise calculation of the necessary techniques and work content of the managerially specified range of, quote, work tasks. That is, the workers, Roy observed, were engaged in a particular form of work measurement, as against, although to some extent conditioned by, managerial, quote, work measurement. But such a form of work measurement does not qualify as a valid form of work measurement as far as Baldamus is concerned. For example, it is interesting to compare the accounts of processes of work measurement and, quote, work measurement provided by Roy, 1952. Endnote 16. See, for example, the discussion by War and Wall, 1975, whose position, quote, is that work will always matter to people, that they will always love work and hate work, and that society, through changing the nature of some work, should help people to love work more than hate work, end quote. All in the interest of the most important consideration, quote, minimizing the time required to perform an operation, end quote. No doubt. And then the final endnote, see Baldamus, 1961, for a discussion of certain social determinants of effort and fatigue, and the conclusion that work is inherently unmeasurable. In contrast, Gortz, 1976, argues, quote, looking for maximum physical productivity is exactly the same as looking for the conditions that allow workers to produce the greatest possible quantity of a given type of product while using the optimum amount of energy in the most rational and effective manner. It is not a matter of reducing the amount of energy used to a minimum. A rhythm of work that is too slow or a job that is too easy or too monotonous is more exhausting than a rhythm and degree of difficulty and complexity that keep the individual productive and intellectually alert. so that conditions for the maximum productive efficiency of labor can be worked out only collectively by the workers themselves, end quote. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening.